Chapter 1. The rain had been falling since dawn, a soft drizzle that painted the cobblestones in silver and turned the sky into a muted watercolor. In the heart of the little town stood the library, a sturdy, old building of stone and brick, its tall windows glowing faintly against the gray outside. Clara paused on the steps before entering, her umbrella trembling slightly as drops cascaded down its edges. She inhaled the familiar scent of rain-soaked earth and faint blossoms from the gardens nearby. Then she pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped inside. The warmth of the library wrapped around her instantly. The hush of the room felt sacred, broken only by the low shuffle of pages and the distant hum of a desk lamp. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the amber light. Clara loosened her scarf, shaking the rain from her umbrella before tucking it neatly by the door. She always felt a kind of belonging here, as if the shelves themselves welcomed her back, whispering, "Here you are again. We've kept your secret safe." She walked slowly through the aisles, fingertips brushing over the familiar spines. Some books were like old friends. Others were strangers waiting for their turn. She had no particular title in mind. Perhaps just something soft, something that would let her forget the weight of the day. Her feet carried her toward the back corner, where the romance novels lived. The shelves here seemed to lean closer together, almost protective, as if they understood the delicacy of the stories they held. As Clara tilted her head to scan a higher shelf, a voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me. You wouldn't happen to know if they have the secret garden here, would you?" The words were gentle, almost careful, as though he was afraid to disturb her reverie. Clara turned. A man stood a few paces away. He looked as though he had only just escaped the storm. His dark hair still damp, a droplet tracing its way along his temple before falling to the collar of his shirt. He carried his jacket folded neatly over one arm, revealing sleeves rolled up in a way that made him seem both composed and unguarded at the same time. His smile was tentative, but there was warmth behind it, the kind that made you feel he wasn't used to intruding but was willing to risk it anyway. Clara blinked, her mind catching on his unusual request. The secret garden? Not the kind of book most men asked for. "Yes," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's actually 2 rows over, near the classics." His hesitant smile shifted into something genuine, and for a fleeting moment, it lit his entire face. "I should have guessed," he replied, his tone easy and warm. "You look like someone who knows her way around books." Clara felt the corner of her lips curve before she could stop it. A small laugh escaped her, surprising her with its brightness. She hadn't laughed with a stranger in months. Maybe years. Something about him felt different. He wasn't hurried. He wasn't impatient. There was a steadiness in his presence, like the way the rain kept falling outside. Constant, calm, certain. "Do you always ask strangers for directions," she teased lightly, "or just when you're lost in a library?" He chuckled, and the sound was low, warm, like velvet. "Only when I need rescuing." "I'm Daniel." "Clara," she replied. The syllables of her name felt unusually intimate in that moment, as though it meant more to give it to him than it should have. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was still. In that stillness, Clara became aware of the world around them, the rain pattering gently against the tall windows, the scent of paper and ink, the faint creak of wood as the building seemed to breathe with them. She caught his eyes again, steady, curious, but not demanding. For a brief second, Clara wondered if fate had nudged her into this moment. She didn't usually believe in fate, but something about the way he looked at her made her heart stumble in its rhythm. Finally, she tilted her head toward the classics section. "Come on," she said quietly. "I'll show you where it is." Daniel's smile softened, and he fell into step beside her. Together, they walked between the tall shelves, their footsteps muffled by the old carpet. The space between them hummed with a quiet energy, as though the library itself was watching, holding its breath, waiting to see what might unfold. And though neither of them could know it yet, this small, ordinary moment, a question about a book on a rainy day, was the beginning of something neither of them would ever forget. Chapter 2. Clara led the way down the quiet aisle, the shelves towering above them like guardians of 1,000 secrets. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that seemed to hold centuries of stories within it. She stopped in front of the classics section, resting her hand lightly on the shelf. "Here," she said, scanning the spines until she found what she was looking for. She pulled a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden free, and turned it in her hands before offering it to him. Daniel took the book carefully, as though it were fragile. His fingers brushed against hers for just an instant, and the smallest spark leapt between them, unexpected but unmistakable. "Thank you," he said softly. His eyes lingered on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary before dropping back to the book. "This one was important to me once." Clara tilted her head, curiosity rising. "Important?" He nodded, tracing the embossed letters on the cover with his thumb. "When I was a kid, my mother used to read it to me. Every night, a few pages before bed. It was the only time the world seemed quiet, safe." Something in his voice shifted, a gentleness undercut with something deeper. Maybe longing, maybe memory. Clara felt her heart stir at the honesty in it. She smiled faintly. "That's a beautiful reason to come back to it." Daniel looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you have a book like that? One that feels like home?" Clara hesitated. No one had asked her that before. She searched the shelf as if the answer might be waiting there, written on a spine. Finally she whispered, "Pride and Prejudice." Daniel's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Of course. A classic. So, are you an Elizabeth Bennet or a Mr. Darcy fan?" Clara laughed quietly, the sound echoing softly between the shelves. "Elizabeth. Obviously. She's clever, independent, unafraid to speak her mind. Mr. Darcy is complicated." "Complicated," Daniel repeated, amused. "That's the polite word for it." Their laughter blended, warm and easy. Clara was surprised at how natural it felt, how quickly the walls around her seemed to lower. She turned slightly, leaning against the shelf, studying him. He had kind eyes, the kind that carried stories even when he wasn't speaking. She wondered what else he carried. What other pieces of himself were tucked away like folded letters in a drawer. For a moment, silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt alive, filled with unspoken possibilities. Daniel broke it softly. "You know, I wasn't planning on being here today. I only came in to get out of the rain." "And yet," Clara said, her voice almost a whisper, "you found exactly what you were looking for." Their eyes met, and the air seemed to still, heavy with something fragile and new. A voice from the front desk suddenly called out, breaking the moment, "The library will be closing in 15 minutes." Clara blinked, realizing how quickly time had slipped away. Daniel looked down at the book in his hands, then back at her. "I should probably check this out," he said. "But I'd hate to leave our conversation unfinished." Clara felt her chest tighten, not with anxiety but with something unexpected. Anticipation. "Then maybe," she said carefully, "you don't have to." Daniel's brows lifted, a question in his eyes, but Clara only smiled. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small notepad she always carried, and scribbled something quickly. With a light hand, she tore the page free and slipped it into the book before closing it in his hands. Her eyes met his again. "For when you're ready." And without waiting for his response, she turned and walked toward the exit, her heart beating faster with each step. Behind her, Daniel stood frozen, holding the book against his chest as though it had suddenly become the most precious thing he owned. Chapter 3. Daniel left the library with the book pressed tightly under his arm, the rain still whispering against the streets outside. The world felt different, though nothing had changed. The same gray clouds hung low, the same puddles stretched across the cobblestones. And yet, inside him, something stirred, like the faint echo of music he hadn't heard in years. He walked slowly, the the memory of Clara's smile replaying in his mind. Her laughter still lingered in his ears, quick, bright, and disarming. It had been so long since something as simple as a conversation had left him feeling alive. When he finally reached his apartment, he tossed his jacket over a chair and set the library book gently on the desk. For a moment, he hesitated, almost afraid to open it. That slip of paper Clara had placed inside seemed to burn against the cover, calling to him. With careful hands he opened the book. The note slipped out, fluttering onto the desk like a fragile secret. His heart quickened as he unfolded it. In neat, flowing handwriting, it read, "If you'd like to finish our conversation, meet me here again next Saturday. Same time. Clara." Daniel's lips curved into a slow, unguarded smile. He read it twice, then a third time, as if the words themselves might vanish if he looked away. Saturday. A single word, but it suddenly gave the week a head shape, gave it color where before there had only been routine. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the rain-slick window, and whispered softly to himself, "Clara." The name felt different on his tongue now. Not just a stranger's, but the beginning of something unknown. The week dragged by with unbearable slowness. Daniel found himself replaying their brief encounter over and over. The way she tilted her head when she smiled, the quiet confidence in her voice, the sparkle in her laugh. He tried to distract himself with work, with errands, with anything, but she had slipped into his thoughts like sunlight through a crack in the blinds. Impossible to ignore once you noticed. And Clara. She wasn't immune either. All week, she found herself drifting back to that moment between the shelves. She could still feel the warmth of his gaze, the way it seemed to see past her words, past her practiced calm. She hadn't meant to leave a note. It wasn't like her to invite a stranger into her life so easily. But something in Daniel's presence had disarmed her usual caution. At night, lying awake, she questioned herself. What if he doesn't come? What if I've imagined it all? And yet, beneath her doubts, there was a quiet spark of anticipation, a thread of hope she hadn't felt in years. When Saturday finally arrived, the rain had cleared. The town glowed under a pale spring sun, the air cool and sweet with the scent of blossoms. Clara arrived at the library a little earlier than usual, her heart pounding with every step. She told herself she might only be there to return a book. That way, if he didn't come, she could pretend it hadn't mattered. But deep down, she knew she was waiting. She drifted through the aisles pretending to browse, but her ears caught every sound. The creak of the door, the shuffle of footsteps, the soft clearing of a throat. Then, just as the clock ticked past noon, she heard the sound she had been waiting for, the quiet fall of footsteps behind her. She turned. There he was. Daniel. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the shelves until his eyes found hers. And when they did, the corners of his lips lifted, slow and certain, as though he'd known all along she would be there. Clara's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm, to match his smile with one of her own. "You came," she said softly. Daniel stepped closer, holding up the book in his hand. "You left me no choice. I couldn't let a mystery like this go unsolved." Clara laughed, the sound a little shaky, but filled with relief. The tension that had been building all week melted, leaving only the fragile joy of seeing him again. They sat together at one of the old wooden tables by the tall windows, sunlight spilling across the floor. At first, their words were careful, polite, about books, about favorite authors, about the town. But as minutes stretched into an hour, their conversation deepened. Daniel spoke of his childhood, of growing up in a quiet house where books had been his escape. Clara shared stories of her own, her love for libraries, her secret dream of writing someday, though she'd never told anyone before. The more they spoke, the more the world outside seemed to fade. Time slipped away unnoticed, as though the library itself was conspiring to give them this moment. At one point, Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You know, when I first asked you about this book, I wasn't really lost. I saw you standing there and, well, I needed a reason to talk to you. Clara blinked, surprised, then felt her cheeks warm. So, you tricked me? Not tricked, he said with a grin. Just improvised. She shook her head, laughing, but inside, her heart swelled. Because in his honesty, she heard something rare. Sincerity. The library bell rang softly in the distance, announcing the hour. Clara glanced at the clock, startled to realize how much time had passed. I should go, she murmured reluctantly, gathering her things. Daniel hesitated, as though wanting to stop her, but instead he simply asked, "Same time next week?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Maybe sooner. And as she walked out into the bright afternoon, she carried with her not just the memory of his smile, but the promise of something unfolding, something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but couldn't bear to resist. Chapter 4. The following week came faster than Clara had expected. She told herself not to think of Daniel too much, not to count the days, but her heart betrayed her. Each morning she caught herself glancing at the calendar, and each evening she replayed their conversations in her mind. And then Saturday arrived again. The library was quieter than usual. The afternoon sun fell in golden stripes across the wooden floors, dust motes drifting like tiny constellations in the air. Clara sat at their table by the tall windows, pretending to read, though the same page had been in front of her for 10 minutes. Her fingers traced absent patterns on the book cover until she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, the soft creak of the library door, the shuffle of footsteps. She looked up, and there he was. Daniel. He carried that same easy smile, but there was something different in his eyes today. A shadow, subtle but present, as if something weighed on him. Clara, he greeted warmly, sliding into the chair across from her. I was hoping you'd be here. She smiled, though she noticed the faint distraction in his voice. Where else would I be? He chuckled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. They began to talk as they had before, about books, about favorite lines, about the small details of their week. Clara found herself leaning in, listening to the cadence of his voice, the way he chose his words carefully, as though each carried meaning. But she also noticed the pauses. Little silences where his gaze would drift toward the window, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. Finally she asked softly, "Is something wrong?" Daniel blinked, as though surprised she had noticed. For a moment he hesitated, then shook his head. No, it's nothing. But Clara could hear the weight behind the words. She didn't press him, not yet. Instead, she gave him a small smile, hoping it was enough to tell him she'd wait for the truth, whenever he was ready. The conversation shifted. Clara found herself telling him more about her life, how she'd grown up in this very town, how the library had been her second home since childhood. It was the one place I could always escape to, she admitted, her eyes distant. When things felt too heavy at home, I'd hide here between the shelves. Books made everything bearable. Daniel listened intently, his gaze steady on her. And now? Clara hesitated. Now I think I still come here for the same reason. To find something bigger than myself. To feel less alone. Her honesty surprised even her. But Daniel didn't look away. Instead, his expression softened, his voice quiet. You're not alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and charged. Clara's heart skipped. She searched his face, wondering if he meant them, or if she was reading more into them than she should. Before she could respond, the librarian's voice called gently from the desk. We'll be closing soon. The moment broke. Daniel glanced toward the sound, then back at Clara, as if he'd left something unsaid. They walked together toward the exit, the late sun painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The town was alive with the weekend hum. Children laughing, shopkeepers closing their doors, the faint smell of bread drifting from the bakery down the street. They stopped just outside the library steps. Clara turned to him, the words balanced on the tip of her tongue. An invitation, a question, something to carry their connection beyond the library walls. But before she could speak, Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his watch. "I should get going," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I promised someone I'd meet them." Clara blinked, surprised. "Oh, of course." He offered a smile, warm but hurried. "I'll see you next week?" She nodded, though her chest felt suddenly heavy. "Yes, next week." Daniel gave a small wave, then turned, disappearing into the crowd with quick strides. Clara stood on the steps for a long moment, the sound of the town around her fading beneath the thrum of her thoughts. She didn't know who he was meeting. She didn't want to wonder. But still, the question pressed against her heart. Was she already reading too much into this? The rain had gone, but the evening air carried a coolness that made her shiver. She pulled her scarf tighter, whispering to herself as though it were a secret. Not alone anymore. But as she walked home, she couldn't help but feel a subtle distance had opened between them. Small, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Chapter 5. Next Saturday came, and Clara found herself arriving earlier than usual. She told herself she wasn't waiting, that she only wanted to enjoy a quiet hour with her book before the library grew busier. But her restless pacing through the aisles betrayed her. Every time the door opened, her heart leapt, only to settle again when it wasn't him. Finally, just as the clock struck noon, Daniel appeared. He looked slightly disheveled this time, his hair damp as though he'd rushed through a morning rain, his shirt a little wrinkled, his eyes carrying a faint weariness. But when he saw her, his entire face softened, and the smile that spread across his lips erased the fatigue in an instant. "Clara," he greeted, his voice low, almost relieved. "You're here." "Of course," she replied, her smile cautious but genuine. "Where else would I be?" They settled into their familiar table by the window. For a while, they spoke as though nothing had changed. About books, about the new spring blooms in the square, about the music drifting from the cafe across the street. But Clara noticed the small things. How Daniel's gaze would sometimes drop, lingering on the table as if hiding a thought. How he ran his thumb over the spine of his book again and again, restless, distracted. At one point, she leaned forward, her tone gentle. "Daniel, are you sure you're all right?" He hesitated. His lips parted, then closed again. His eyes flickered to hers, full of something unspoken. Longing perhaps, or sorrow. Finally he said softly, "I'm fine." "Really?" Clara wanted to believe him. But something in his voice told her the truth was more complicated. Still she let it go. For now. As the afternoon drifted by, they fell into a rhythm of shared silences and soft laughter. Daniel told her about his favorite author, how he had read the same book 6 times because each time it seemed to change, reflecting the different man he was becoming. Clara listened with fascination, admiring the way his mind worked. Thoughtful, deliberate, always searching for meaning. And then without thinking she confessed, "Sometimes, I imagine writing my own story. Not just reading others' words, but creating my own. But then I stop because, who would care to read it?" Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes shot with conviction. "I would. I'd read every word." The intensity in his tone startled her, warmth flooding her cheeks. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Instead, silence stretched between them, comfortable yet electric. Later, as they left the library together, Daniel slowed his pace, as though reluctant to part. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth from the earlier rain. They reached the corner where their paths usually split. Clara hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to walk a little farther?" Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say no. But then he nodded, and together they strolled down the narrow lantern-lit streets. It was during this walk that Clara caught the first glimpse of the truth. They passed a cafe, its windows glowing warmly against the twilight. Through the glass, a couple laughed, leaning close over steaming cups of coffee. Daniel's eyes lingered on them, and something in his expression changed, a flicker of longing, edged with regret. Clara followed his gaze. "Do you know them?" she asked gently. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked away quickly. "No. Just reminded me of something I lost." The words slipped out before he could stop them. His voice was soft, almost broken. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to reach for his hand, to ease the ache she heard in his tone. But before she could, he forced a small smile, shaking his head as though brushing away the moment. "Forget I said that," he murmured. "I didn't mean to burden you." Clara swallowed, her heart heavy. "You're not a burden." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them, the glow of the lanterns, the quiet rhythm of their steps. But then Daniel glanced away, and the spell broke. When they reached Clara's street, she paused, wishing she could keep him there a little longer. "Thank you for walking with me," she said softly. Daniel's smile was faint, almost bittersweet. "Thank you for waiting for me." She tilted her head, puzzled. "Waiting?" He hesitated, then shook his head with a soft laugh. "Never mind. I'll see you next week." And with that, he turned and walked away, his figure retreating into the shadows of the quiet street. Clara stood for a long moment, her heart torn between the warmth of his presence and the chill of his distance. She whispered to the empty night, "What are you hiding, Daniel?" The lantern above her flickered, casting shifting patterns across the cobblestones, as though even the light couldn't decide whether to reveal or conceal. Chapter 6. The days passed in their familiar rhythm, but for Clara, time seemed to stretch longer than usual. The week felt endless, each hour marked by the ache of waiting. She told herself not to think of Daniel too often, but it was useless. His words lingered, circling in her thoughts like the refrain of a song she couldn't forget. When Saturday finally came, she arrived at the library earlier than ever. She sat at their table by the tall windows, pretending to read, but her eyes kept lifting toward the door. And then he appeared. Daniel walked in quietly, carrying his usual book, though today he also held something else, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges as though he had read it many times. Clara's curiosity sparked, but he tucked it into his book before she could see more. "Clara," he greeted, his smile warm, though there was a faint tiredness in his eyes. "You're late," she teased, though her tone was softer than her words. "Am I?" he asked, checking his watch with a sheepish grin. "I suppose I am. Forgive me." Her laughter bubbled up, easing the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. "Always." They fell into their usual rhythm, yet today, their conversation flowed differently. Slower, quieter, as though both of them were guarding unspoken thoughts. Clara found herself studying him more closely. The way his fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, the slight crease between his brows when he thought too hard, the flicker of sadness that crossed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. At one point she asked softly, "What are you reading?" Daniel lifted the book, tapping its cover. "Poetry. Something about it steadies me." "Will you read one to me?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. Opening the book, his voice dropped into a low, rich cadence as he read aloud. "And when I thought I was lost, I found you. Not in the thunder, but in the quiet rain." His voice faltered at the last line. He closed the book gently, his eyes lifting to hers. Clara's heart thudded. "That's beautiful." Daniel smiled faintly. "It reminds me that sometimes what saves us isn't loud or grand. Sometimes it's the quiet things, the unnoticed things." He didn't say more, but Clara felt as though he had told her something without speaking it outright. Later, as the afternoon waned, they walked together through the town square. The market stalls were closing, the scent of fresh bread and cut flowers lingering in the air. They stopped at a small fountain, the water catching the last of the sunlight. Clara leaned against the stone edge, watching the ripples, her mind full of questions she didn't dare ask. "Daniel," she began carefully. Last time, you said something about losing something. What did you mean? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the water. Finally he said, "Everyone carries ghosts, Clara. Some are easier to ignore than others." She turned to him, her breath catching. His face was calm, but his eyes were oceans of grief and longing. She wanted to reach for him, to tell him he didn't have to carry it alone. But before she could, he smiled, soft and deliberate, as if drawing a curtain across the moment. "Come," he said lightly, offering his hand. "Let's not drown in ghosts today." Clara hesitated, then placed her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a current through her, and for a brief dizzying moment, it felt like everything she had been searching for was right there. In his palm, in his smile, in the way he looked at her as though she mattered. They walked on, hand in hand, until the sun dipped below the rooftops and the lanterns flickered to life. At her street, he released her gently, as though reluctant to let go. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, her heart tight. He gave her that bittersweet smile again, then disappeared into the night. Clara stood beneath the lantern's glow, her hand still tingling from his touch. She should have felt comforted, hopeful. Instead, she felt both closer to him and further away than ever. She whispered into the quiet, "What are you hiding from me?" The only answer was the soft murmur of the fountain in the distance, as if even the night was keeping his secret. Chapter 7. Clara had grown used to their Saturdays together. She had grown used to his presence, the way his voice softened when he read aloud, the quiet humor in his smile, the way time seemed to fold itself differently around him. But today, something was different. When Daniel arrived, he was later than usual. His steps were slower, his eyes carrying a weariness that no smile could quite conceal. He apologized as he always did, but the word felt heavier this time, weighted with something unsaid. "You're here now," Clara replied softly, though worry prickled at her chest. They settled at their table near the window. Daniel set his book down but didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back, running a hand through his hair, as though gathering strength. Clara noticed the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights. For a while, she let the silence sit, afraid to break whatever fragile balance held him together. Finally she asked, "Long week?" Daniel's lips curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. "You could say that." They spoke of lighter things first, a poem she had discovered, a novel he recommended, the weather turning colder. Yet beneath his words, Clara sensed something fraying. His gaze wandered more often. His laughter seemed slower to come. When she gently teased him about his coffee, "Too strong again?" his answer came delayed. "Some days, strong is all that keeps me standing." The words slipped out before he could stop them. His eyes flicked to hers, as if realizing he had revealed too much. Clara leaned in, her voice steady. "Daniel, what's weighing on you?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening, as though fighting the instinct to retreat. She thought he might brush it aside, make a joke, change the subject. But instead, he exhaled slowly, the air leaving him like a confession. "My father," he said at last. His voice was quiet, raw. "He's been ill for a long time. Some days are better than others. Lately, it's been harder." Clara's breath caught. The ache in his tone was unmistakable. "Daniel," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." He shook his head, a small, determined motion. "It's all right. It's just life. He needs me. And I can't let him down." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She simply watched him, watched the way he looked down at his hands, the way his fingers pressed into the table as though anchoring himself. Finally, she murmured, "That must be so heavy to carry." His eyes lifted to hers then, and for the first time, Clara saw it fully. The exhaustion, the grief, the quiet strength that was born not of choice, but of necessity. It is, he admitted softly. But I don't want people to see me as broken or burdened. I want to be strong. For him. For myself. Clara's heart ached. She wanted to reach across the table, to take his hand, to tell him that strength wasn't measured by how much pain one could hide. But she sensed how carefully he guarded his walls, how fragile this openness was. So instead, she offered her presence, steady, patient, unjudging. You don't have to hide from me, she said gently. His gaze lingered on her, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that tried to be brave but couldn't quite mask the sorrow beneath it. Careful, Clara, he said quietly. If I believed that, I might tell you everything. Her pulse quickened. She wanted him to. She wanted to know every piece of his hidden world. But she also knew some truths could not be rushed. Then tell me, she whispered. But Daniel only shook his head, his eyes drifting back toward the window where the rain had begun to fall. Not today. Not yet. They walked together again after the library closed, as they always did. The night was cool, the lamplight painting long shadows across the cobblestones. Daniel spoke little, and Clara didn't press him. She understood. Sometimes silence said more than words. At the fountain, he paused, staring into the rippling water as though it held answers he could not find. My father was the one who taught me to love books, he said suddenly. When I was a boy, he used to sit with me every evening, no matter how tired he was, and read aloud. He made stories feel alive. Even now, when I read, it feels like he's still with me. That's why I come back to the library. It's the closest thing I have to him when I'm afraid of losing him. Clara swallowed hard, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. That's not weakness, Daniel, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. That's love. For a moment, the air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken truths. Daniel's eyes softened, filled with a longing that mirrored her own. But then, as though catching himself, he looked away. I should go, he murmured. He left her there by the fountain, the rain misting lightly in the air. Her heart torn between admiration for his strength and fear of the walls he still kept between them. As she watched his figure fade into the night, Clara whispered to herself, How can I reach you, Daniel, when you won't let me in? Chapter 8. The days grew colder, the air sharp with the first breath of winter. The library felt quieter now, its warm light a refuge from the gray skies outside. Clara noticed that Daniel had grown more distant in recent weeks. He still came to meet her, still smiled when he saw her, but there was a restlessness in his eyes. As though each moment he gave her was borrowed, stolen from a life that was pulling him away. She told herself to be patient, to wait. But patience had its limits. And Clara could no longer ignore the ache of not knowing. That evening, when they sat together at their usual table, she placed her book down and looked at him squarely. Daniel, she said softly but firmly, I need you to trust me. Not with a piece, not with half-truths. With all of it. His jaw tightened, his gaze falling to the pages of the unopened book in front of him. For a long while, he said nothing. The silence stretched until it pressed against her chest. Finally, he whispered, If I tell you, Clara, you may see me differently. Her voice shook, but she held it steady. Then let me decide how I'll see you. Daniel closed his eyes, his hands resting against the table as though steadying himself against a storm. My father isn't just sick, he began slowly, his voice low and rough. He's fading. The doctors don't say it, but I see it. Every day he grows weaker. And I can't stop it. Clara's breath caught. She reached for his hand, but he didn't take hers. His fingers curled into a fist instead, knuckles pale. I spend every night with him, Daniel continued. Making sure he eats, making sure he doesn't fall when he tries to walk. I read to him, because it's the only thing that still brings light to his eyes. But it's getting harder. And when I leave him, Even just to come here, I feel guilty. His voice cracked on the word. Clara felt her own eyes sting. You're carrying this all alone, she whispered. He gave a bitter laugh. What choice do I have? My sister left years ago. My mother's gone. It's just me and him. And the truth is, I'm terrified of losing him. But I'm also terrified of what comes after. Because when he's gone, what will I have left? The words hung heavy in the air. Clara's heart twisted at the rawness of his confession. She saw him now, not just the man who smiled through his weariness, not just the gentle presence who read poetry at her side. She saw the truth. A man stretched thin between love and loss, strength and sorrow. Slowly, she reached across the table again. This time, he didn't pull away. His hand trembled as hers closed around it, the warmth of her touch breaking through the walls he had held so tightly. You'll have yourself, she whispered. And you'll have me. If you'll let me be there. His eyes lifted to hers then, wide, uncertain, filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. You don't know what you're offering, he said hoarsely. I do, Clara replied. Her voice shook, but her gaze didn't waver. I'm offering to stand beside you. Not to fix everything. I can't. But to be there. So you don't have to fight this alone. For a long moment, the world seemed to still. The library around them faded into silence, the rain tapping faintly against the tall windows. And then, with a sigh that sounded almost like surrender, Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. Something shifted between them. Fragile, yet powerful. A bond no longer built on shared books and quiet moments, but on truth, pain, and the promise of standing together in the storm. Later that evening, as they walked again beneath the lamplight, Clara noticed that his steps were slower, but lighter, as though the burden had eased if only slightly, now that it was shared. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer filled with secrets, but with a quiet understanding. When they reached the fountain, he stopped. His hand still held hers. His eyes, though shadowed with grief, shone with something new. Hope, tentative but real. Clara, he said softly, I don't know how this ends. I don't know how to be anything but what I am right now. She smiled gently, her heart aching but certain. Then let's just begin where we are. For the first time in weeks, Daniel's smile reached his eyes. And as they stood together under the falling rain, Clara knew, whatever came next, she would not let him carry it alone. Chapter 9. The week that followed was the gentlest they had known together. For the first time, Clara felt the weight that hung over Daniel begin to loosen. Not vanish, never that, but soften. As though the burden now shared had left space for something else to grow. On Saturday afternoon, the library wasn't their only refuge. Instead, Daniel led her through the winding streets, past rows of narrow brick houses, until they reached the little park tucked between them. The trees there had shed most of their leaves, their bare branches stretching into the pale sky. But the ground was a quilt of gold and rust, and the air carried the scent of earth and wood smoke. Daniel stooped, picked up a leaf, and held it out to her. Look at this, he said, his voice lighter than she'd heard in weeks. It's perfect. Clara smiled, brushing her fingers over its crisp edge. It's just a leaf. Not just. He tucked it into the pages of her notebook. It'll last longer this way. They walked slowly, their shoulders brushing, their hands occasionally grazing but never pulling apart. Clara found herself laughing more than she expected. Daniel's humor was quiet, subtle, the kind that slipped into conversation without effort. She hadn't realized until now how much he held back, how much of his warmth was buried under the silence of worry. At one point, he stopped beside a bench, eyes lifting toward the sky. When I was a kid, he said, my father used to bring me here after school. We'd sit right there and eat sandwiches my mother packed. He'd quiz me on the names of the trees. Clara tilted her head, smiling. And? Did you pass? He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I failed miserably. I still can't tell the difference between an oak and a maple. You just gave yourself away, she teased. That one, she pointed toward a tall trunk just ahead, is an oak. The big leaves like open hands. Daniel looked at her in mock surprise. You mean to tell me all this time I've been dating a secret botanist? Her cheeks flushed at the word dating. He hadn't said it before. But he didn't take it back. And she didn't correct him. As evening settled, they wandered back through the streets. The lamps flickered on one by one, casting golden pools of light on the damp cobblestones. At Clara's door they lingered. The night air was crisp, their breath rising in pale clouds. Daniel hesitated, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his eyes unreadable. Clara's heart raced. She wanted to bridge the space between them, to lean into the quiet certainty she felt every time his gaze lingered on hers. But she waited. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low, almost shy. Clara, thank you. For staying. For not walking away when I handed you all the worst parts of me. Her chest ached. She shook her head. They're not the worst. They're just human. And you don't scare me, Daniel. Something in his expression softened then, the guarded lines of his face easing into openness. He leaned closer, slowly, giving her every chance to pull back. She didn't. And when his lips finally brushed hers, it was not hurried or desperate. It was gentle. A kiss that felt like a promise. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. For the first time in a long time, he whispered, I don't feel alone. That night, as Clara watched him disappear into the fog, her heart swelled with both joy and dread. Joy, because she had never felt so close to another soul. Dread, because she knew shadows still lingered in his life. Shadows no kiss, no tenderness, could completely erase. But for now, she held on to the quiet kind of joy they had found. And it was enough. Chapter 10. The winter air was sharp that morning, the kind that seeped into your lungs and made every breath sting. Clara wrapped her scarf tighter as she made her way toward Daniel's house, her boots crunching over the thin layer of frost that glazed the ground. She had not seen him since that night by her door, since the kiss that had changed everything. A week had passed, filled with hurried notes and brief conversations, but always cut short. He had grown quiet again, retreating into himself. And she knew why. His father's condition had worsened. Clara hesitated on the front step, staring at the faded paint on the door. For a moment, fear whispered in her ear. What if he's decided there's no room for you in his life? What if you are just a distraction, a kindness he can no longer afford? But she knocked anyway. The door opened slowly. Daniel stood there, his face pale, exhaustion heavy in the shadows under his eyes. And yet, when he saw her, a faint light flickered across his expression, as if her presence alone gave him breath. Clara, he said softly, voice roughened by sleepless nights. I wasn't sure you'd come. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that carried the weight of illness. She caught sight of a photograph on the hallway table. Daniel, younger with his father, both smiling beneath the shade of a tree. He noticed her gaze, and for a moment his composure wavered. He doesn't have much time, Daniel admitted. Some days he recognizes me, some days he doesn't. And I. His voice cracked. He turned away, as though ashamed to show her the break in his armor. Clara touched his arm gently. You don't have to finish that sentence. I understand. He looked at her then, really looked, as though searching her face for something he couldn't name. But this isn't your burden. I don't want to tie you to my grief. Her heart ached at the words. She wanted to tell him she was already tied, that from the moment they met among the shelves of the library she had been drawn into his orbit. But instead, she simply said, love doesn't work that way. You don't get to choose only the joy and push away the sorrow. It's all or nothing, Daniel. The silence between them was thick, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that held an answer, waiting. Finally he exhaled, long and unsteady. Then I choose all of it. I choose you, Clara. Even if it's messy, even if it's unfair. I don't know what tomorrow will look like, but I can't imagine it without you. Her eyes stung with tears, but she smiled through them. Good. Because I was never going to let you go. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a kind of desperate tenderness, as though she was the only thing keeping him upright. And in that embrace, Clara felt the weight of his pain, yes, but also the spark of something stronger. Something that could outlast even the darkest winter. Later, as the sky dimmed into twilight, Clara stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall. Daniel joined her, his hand brushing against hers before entwining their fingers together. Do you think we'll be okay? He asked quietly. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We'll be more than okay. We'll be real. And that's better. They stood there in silence, watching the snow blur the world into white. For that moment, there was no past and no future. Only the fragile, perfect present. But outside, the storm gathered. Clara knew challenges waited. The slow fading of a man Daniel loved. The choices they would have to make when life demanded more than they felt able to give. Still, as she looked at him, she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough to begin again.